One Question is designed to give subscribers valuable insights on how executive leaders in college athletics think about key issues on their respective campuses, in their departments, or within their leagues and conferences.
Greetings, this is Ty Brown and welcome to One Question, where we highlight executive leaders in college athletics. I'm here on campus at Loyola Marymount University, and I'm joined by Craig Pintens. Craig is the athletics director of the Lions. Greetings, Craig. Thanks for having me here.
Well, thanks for coming down the street and showing up today. Appreciate everything you do for college athletics.
Yes, sir. Thank you. You've been in a little over a year here, and after you get in a year, you start to figure out what you're doing, right? And
I don't know if I've figured it out yet, but I'm getting closer.
Right. People start to figure out how they like to be led and how you lead, right? And one of the things you've noticed that I noticed that I heard you talk about one day in the past is that how you evaluate your coaches. I think it's unique, but you use ratings or these indexes that are, I guess, relevant to each sport in terms of at the end of the season, you talk about how you did in the season instead of wins and losses. Can you talk to me about what this consists of and why did you choose this method of evaluation?
Sure. Well, obviously, having been a number of different places, I've always put a high value on evaluations at the end of the year. And obviously, coaching evaluations are a lot different for those that have done them than administrative evaluations. Administrative evaluations kind of fall in that normal HR box. Coaching evaluations are a little bit more abstract. And so we redid our coaching evaluation from scratch, and we really focused on the four pillars of our athletic department, which are recruit, teach, win, and graduate. So the recruiting and the teaching and the graduation, those are all things that we want all of our coaches to focus on. But from a quantitative standpoint, and the index is part of your question, is really taking a look at each individual sport and what is the metric that is used in that particular sport to get you into the postseason. And so for obviously men's basketball, that has changed to the net. And for a lot of sports, it's still the RPI. And so what we did is we took the total number of teams that are compete in that particular sport, and then we've taken where you finished at the end of the season, and that gives you a percentile ranking. So what it does is it creates somewhat of a little bit of competition within our department, which is okay. Competition is healthy, and coaches are among the most competitive people in the world, period. And what it does is it really takes, if you have only 80 teams that compete in your particular sport, and you finished 20th in the country, technically that's 75th percentile. If you finish 20 out of 350 teams, that certainly is a lot better percentile ranking. And I'm not going to do the math on that one right in my head like that, but it's a lot better percentile ranking than 20 out of 80.
Right. It's interesting when you implemented it.
Probably mid-year. Yeah,
okay.
No, it was really, it just kind of came to me as we did our fall evaluations. We put RPI in our evaluations or the metric in that particular sport for our fall sports and examine that. And obviously we put win-loss record and conference record, all the metrics that you can possibly take into account for winning. But as we got into the winter, I realized I basically in the fall and in the winter and in the spring for all of our sports, I never look at what the particular record is. And I probably couldn't tell you at any given point what a record, I hate to I've explained this to our coaches and they were blown away. I couldn't tell you what our win-loss record is because all I'm doing is the first time that it is listed anywhere, I'm going to take a look at the RPI or, in basketball, Ken Palm or some of the other tools that are out there, the KPI, all the different ones that are possibly available. And even there's some random ones out there that I found for soccer and volleyball that I'm paying attention to that to see where we rank nationally or where we rank within our own conference or region more so than I am really win-loss record. And in some sports, cross country in the fall introduced a completely new metric called the CCRI, which really takes into account where you rank nationally for the first time, as opposed to they've always had regional rankings. And the West is a great region for cross country. And so it was really hard to gauge, well, what does that mean? We're ranked in the top 15 in our region. There's a lot of regions. So where do we actually rank nationally? And so those type of things that really got me thinking probably after the fall of that's what I'm always looking at. So why shouldn't we include that in the evaluations?
Now, some of the sports have 2 or 3 type of measurements, right?
Sure.
Type of ratings. and I guess you focus on the one that the sport actually uses to get people.
Yeah, it's hard because if you ask any of the committees, there's a lot that goes into evaluation. The eye test is used quite frequently as a phrase. Obviously, in men's basketball, when you look at the nitty gritty sheets now, they include pretty much all those rankings right on the top of that particular sheet. But using it as a quick anecdote, when we were doing the evaluation for our women's basketball, Charity Elliott, who had an outstanding year, made the WNIT, coming down the stretch, she'd probably find this pretty humorous, but I basically had taken a spreadsheet. I had some free time at night once, and I'm trying to evaluate. I'm breaking down the WNIT field at this point to try to figure out if we're going to be in or not. One of the 32 teams selected for the WNIT, and we played a great schedule last year. We played the 77th ranked schedule in the country. We ended the season at 111. I think on selection Monday we were a little bit higher than that, but postseason adjusted that for all the teams. And I know we were 2-5 versus the top 50, so I knew those things. So we get to Charity's evaluation, and it was filled out by the sports supervisor when we get to it. And I said, Charity, just so you know, I don't really know how many wins you had this year. I said, I know you had somewhere between 17 and 19 because I know you didn't have 20 because 20 is a magic number in basketball. I know you didn't have 20, but you were somewhere between 17 and 19, but I know what your RPI was. It was 111. And she just kind of looked at me like, wow. But she also, we've had plenty of conversations about it, so it wasn't a surprise for her. I think she was surprised that I didn't know that they had 18 wins. But it also kind of set the tone of you're measured based on how you finish nationally. And that's something that I've talked about since I started here is something that we want to do. We want to measure ourselves nationally in all of our sports. And really this metric helps measure us nationally.
And it's interesting. You talk about magic numbers. Basketball is 20. I mean, basketball, and there's some other sports you can get 20 wins, but that may not. They may.
No, it's basketball is a magic number of 20, and softball and baseball 40. And in some cases, that you have to take that into account too. You take into account where your team is and where the progress is, because at the end of the day, if you have 20 wins in basketball, that's a nice recruiting piece to put out there. You have back-to-back 20-win seasons. You get 3 in a row, and now all of a sudden you start coming up with these crazy stats of, we have the most wins in California over a 3-year period or whatever it might be. And so that does factor in. The winning portion is really important. But guess what? The winning portion also affects the metrics. And if you win a lot, but you don't play a great schedule, your metrics aren't going to be real high. If you win a lot and you play a great schedule, your metrics are going to be unbelievable. And in the case of playing a really tough schedule and maybe not having the results to show for, I want our coaches to feel good about that and feel good about where they finish nationally. We have some teams here that had a rough year because of injuries and other things that you take into account, had a really tough schedule, and then ended up finishing pretty high nationally. Based off of what the record was, mainly because they played a great schedule. And I want the coach to understand, hey, I'm all for that. I understand. And so I think hopefully going forward, it's something that our coaches will understand.
So from my understanding, talking before we started recording, is that this is in progress.
Yeah, it's definitely a work in progress. It's something that we really only had a chance this spring to speak with our coaches from the winter and the spring and kind of, I didn't share the full index with them in comparison to other sports within the department, but certainly talked a lot about where they finished nationally and what index we used to kind of measure them. And I think most of them are receptive, and most of them are well aware of that number anyway. It's something that they know about.
I wonder what the thought process is. If you know them well enough to be able to read their mind.
Oh, well, Ty, if I could read people's mind, I wouldn't be doing this. I'd be finding something else to do.
Funny,
yeah. No, there's I do think a few of them, you can tell by body language, are kind of taken aback a little bit by the approach, particularly, in one of the sports where we didn't necessarily have a great record. And I told that specific coach, I don't know what it's kind of similar because in that particular case, I didn't know the record at all. Yeah. I said, I have no idea what your record was. And I looked at the sheet. I said, kind of surprised. I thought you had more wins than that because your national ranking was a lot higher. Mm-hmm. I said, you played a really tough schedule. That's why. And I think that particular coach was pretty relieved because when you get to that portion and you don't have a lot to show for, it can be difficult, but it's not when you played a really good schedule. Now, the flip side of that is, keep in mind, you also have outside entities that are not measuring it by this, what I'm talking about. They're measuring it strictly by wins and losses. They don't necessarily get into the nitty-gritty, if you want to use a real term that is used. They don't get into that. They can just tell you they can probably tell you what the record was of a team, and that's how the outside is evaluating coaches. So you still have to take that into account in your overall evaluation.
What the public sees and that kind of thing. I wonder about when coaches are giving their input on scheduling. I guess over time, will you see effect in that when you talk about future scheduling?
I hope so. With that being said, I think our coaches here, one of the things when I started was to talk to each of them about how they schedule, what their scheduling philosophy is. And most of them have a real understanding of scheduling. And I think when you're at a school of our size and when you're in the WCC, you understand what it takes in your particular sport to try to get some of those games that you want. And for the most part, a lot of our coaches play very tough schedules here. We don't have a lot of coaches that really don't play a tough schedule. If you look at where we rank nationally in terms of schedule, and that is something I probably could add in, but quite frankly, in some of the sports, that doesn't necessarily exist. You just get the metrics spit out at the end. And I mean, if you ask anybody about the net, they know what components go in, but they're not really sure how the weight particularly is in that. Should you win by 10 points or more? Or, you want to get it down to 9. You hit a 3 at the buzzer when it's 12. I mean, does that help you? I don't know. What it's not going to move your needle that much. I know that.
That human element is the gray area factor.
Well, and ultimately, you bring up a great point, though. The index is great, and I'm a very quantitative person, so I like numbers. I always have been fascinated by them in sports. It's a great thing. However, to that point that we talked about earlier, still has to pass the eye test. And there's certain elements of watching a team play all year that go into that number, because there are factors that you can't see on a piece of paper, like how young was the team? How did you have something that happened traumatic during the season that affected the team? Did you have an injury or injuries that affected? Did you have something traumatic that happened during the season that affects the number? And that you don't see that on a piece of paper.
This, to me, seems like it'll probably grow here on campus in terms of it's obviously significant because the coaches are like, this is what I'm being evaluated by, internally and externally. But I wonder how you will emphasize this inside the department, like in terms of making sure it's visible and everybody knows this is what we're looking at.
Yeah, well, one of the things I've as we do this in my office, I am planning on taking the spreadsheet that I do have and, blowing it up to not a huge thing in my office. I don't need to make it, it's not going to take up a whole wall. It's not a mural type thing, but it'll be, a significant size, probably at least 8 by 10 on a nicely printed and put that up in my office just so it is visible. And if people ask about it, I can bring it up as a conversation piece. It's one of the reasons why one of the things I mounted off the wall, not just on the wall, off the wall. So you cannot miss this when you walk into my office, is how many Directors' Cup points we had last year, because ultimately that's the ultimate for any of our teams, is to make it into the NCAA tournament and accumulate some Directors' Cup points. So we had 100 Directors' Cup points last year. We had 50 for volleyball and 50 for baseball. And volleyball in this index, I throw, if you make the NCAA on this index, I throw out wherever you were. You get some bonus points for that. So volleyball finished tied for 17th in the country because in the Directors' Cup, that's what they were. They were tied for 17th. Baseball finished tied for 17th in the country because they made a regional final. And so those metrics get thrown out the window if you make the NCAA. So that's the ultimate incentive.
The ultimate goal. You got to get there. This seems like a very interesting thing and almost like an equalizer among sports kind of situation in terms of evaluation. Where do I rank? I mean, where does my percentage is always.
Well, and I think percentage is valuable because there are so many different NCAA sports that have a wide variety of participants. Obviously, when you're talking about a basketball, and men's basketball is 353 teams. Interestingly enough, women's basketball is 351. It'd be a great trivia question to name the two that don't. I think one of them is Citadel. I don't know the other one. That's just off the top of my head. But then you talk about a sport like water. We have water polo, men's and women's water polo. Well, there's not as many teams that play water polo. So your ranking is going to be different in that particular sport.
Well, Craig, this is interesting to me. I think your coaches will find it interesting, and obviously, like you said,
I hope they find it interesting when we present it as a whole to the group. I mean, we've presented enough individually, but I think as a whole, it'll be interesting to see what the reaction is.
Well, like you said, and like we all know, competition is a big part of college athletics. So I think this will be actually wonderful for what you're doing here. And there may be some people who pick up on this around the country. I really appreciate you having me here and joining me on the One Question podcast.
Well, thank you. Appreciate having me and appreciate everything you do. And you're obviously welcome here in Westchester anytime.
That was Craig Pintens. He is the athletics director here at Loyola Marymount University. And of course, this is Ty Brown with One Question. And keep in mind, the role of a leader is to create and maintain an environment that people want to be a part of. And as always, be better tomorrow than you are today. This episode of One Question is produced by Spades Media Group, solving problems using creative leadership.